and it's the 21st of October 2005, and I'm in the old Guildhall, which is the house of Peter and Margaret Spufford, and now it's Margaret Spufford's turn to be in front of the camera. Off camera is Peter Spufford, and behind the camera, as usual, is Giorgio Riello. They may speak, but mainly you'll hear questions addressed by me, also behind the camera, to Margaret Spufford. Now, Margaret, I usually like to begin at the beginning, but in your case, it's far from clear where the beginning is. If we look you up in Who's Who, you reveal nothing about your education until you got an MA with distinction from the University of Leicester.
Well, you can say that that was the beginning, that's why I began there. But you could also say that I'm remembering when during the war, what is the superior of the Jesuits called?
The general, I
The
think.
Vicar General or whatever of the Jesuits came to call on the house we were in. We had been taken away to in North Wales because of my father's work being trifle difficult, and he involved me. I was 4. He involved me in a long conversation in which I apparently spoke up very clearly, and he said to my mother, I remember this child will certainly be a historian, because I'd been arguing the toss over Cromwell and Charles I with him. So the beginning is very difficult to pinpoint, and the beginning in my case was unusual anyway, because the part of North Wales we were in was Welsh speaking, and my parents didn't want to expose me to that particularly, and I was also, even then, ill an awful lot. So my mother taught me. Now that may sound like a very soft option, but it wasn't, because my father and mother were both scientists, and she, according to him, the more able of the two, and indeed according to the class list at Cambridge, because in 1917 she was the only person, male or female, in the parallel class list to get a first in part 2 of the natural science tripos.
She became a fellow of Newman.
And she became indeed a fellow of Newman. Her teaching had much more effect on me than I can possibly estimate. I do remember her saying to me, again I think when I was about 4, I don't know what intellectual crime I just committed, but her saying, no, that's not the way you do it. First of all, you have an idea, then you go and look for the evidence to support that idea, or perhaps to say that it's not true. If it's not true, then you change the idea. You must never, ever, ever change the evidence. Change the idea, not the evidence. And I have thought about that quite a lot, because I think the reason for me turning out such an empiricist as I am is partly because of being brought up in this atmosphere of constant scientific challenge.
The scientific method.
The scientific method, exactly. My old sister, who thought in very much the same way, and I think again that's an upbringing question.
Yes, but you didn't acquire their scientific interests.
Well, I couldn't very well because I wasn't at school, and then I did. My mother had a very bad stroke when I was 10. After that, we were moved back to Cheshire, and I had a year, nearly a year, at the local grammar school before I fell ill again, which I revelled in, but I despised the science they taught there because it was so itsy-bitsy, and I did know better than that just from accounts and seeing my father's lab and that sort of thing. And then I was once again ill, and spent a lot of time. I did my O-levels in hospital in London, where I could teach myself the art subjects that I could teach myself. I once gave the matron of this hospital a terrible shock because I was having difficulty with Keats' Hyperion. I don't know whether you've ever looked at that rather long poem yourself, but it has a remarkable number of incestuous and curious relationships, and I got so confused that I graphed them all out and stuck them on the wall opposite the end of my bed. And the matron came in. It was a very rigid, old-fashioned hospital. The matron came in and said, "Very nice, yes, good. What is all this?" "Sister, do you know what this young girl is doing with her time?" So there you are, you see. Study of the poets can lead one into trouble.
So, strong early intellectual interests
Yes.
fostered by scientific parents.
Yes.
But you couldn't work in laboratories. And an early interest in history?
An early interest in history, and in really anything I could get hold of to read. There was a strong ornithological interest. I spent most of my time off up a tree, bird watching. It was a good garden for that.
Did anybody give you a Norman penny?
No. Nobody gave me a Norman penny. They gave me books. Books after book after book after book. But again, it didn't cause trouble. I had free range reading at all the bookshelves.
But places, Margaret, too. You've mentioned several places already. Obviously a very strong interest in a place, the place.
Yes. Yes. A very strong interest in the place, and the beginnings. I think I was rather slow developing that way. The beginnings of a great interest in places and the contrasts between them, which was enlarged, I think, by all this flitting round.
Yes.
Which my family was forced into.
Okay.
I had that 1 year at grammar school, right at the beginning of grammar school, and then I had a blessed nearly a year, in the middle of which my father died, when I was at the county high school for girls here, where I had no A levels. I had the handful of O levels I collected, and I headmistress was the most amazing woman. She sat behind her desk and looked at me and said, "So what do you want to do, dear? Do you want to do A levels, or do you want to do Oxford and Cambridge entrance, or what?" And I said, "Well, I thought I'd do Oxford and Cambridge entrance, please, but I don't think I could do A levels because it's not the same syllabus, and I really will be a bit pushed." And she said, "Yes, you will, because you've got to acquire French and Latin, haven't you?" And I said, "Yes, indeed I have." Regretting bitterly the Latin I hadn't had at grammar school, because I really liked Latin. And so I had what you might call a crash course. And that was the only bit of normal schooling I had, or near to normal schooling, which I enjoyed very much. But after that, after getting my scholarship to Oxford and my place at Cambridge, and I had to take the scholarship, which I didn't want because of the money again, like my husband. My mother was very poor as a widow. I didn't survive more than that. I survived one term at Oxford, and that was all. I don't know whether it is proper to leap into an anecdote which comes much later. My great patron, as you will discover, was Herbert Finberg. Not W.G. Hoskins, surprisingly. It always surprises people, but Herbert Finberg. And Herbert knew my history in the end and was immensely kind. But on one occasion he was totally overwhelmed by what had happened to him and committed the most gross error possible. We'd given him a festschrift, and we'd actually managed to keep, it was Joan Klusk was the editor, of course, and we'd managed to keep all knowledge of this from him, which I think is quite unusual. And typographer though he was, and exceptionally, I can't think of the right word, fussy isn't adequate.
Precise, careful.
Totally precise, totally careful. He went round all evening. We gave him a dinner, and we gave him this at the sherry before the dinner. and he went round all evening cradling it as if it was a baby. He was delighted, and then he gave a little speech at the end, in which he ran, totally unprepared of course, in which he ran down the list of contributors, and in the process of doing this he reached my name, and undermined as he was and overwhelmed as he was, he said, and then we come to my darling Margaret. My darling Margaret, who as far as I know is the only student with the unique distinction of having attended both our ancient universities without obtaining a degree at either. And it really was very funny, but I was quite cross.
Well, it's a considerable distinction.
Well, it is. Not
So-
many people have done that.
How was it that you came under, how is it that you fell under Finberg's interest?
Well,
Yes.
after my mother's teaching, I would say the second person who had considerable influence on me and importance for me is Dr. Esther Moyer, whom you may not know.
Yes.
You do?
Yes, I do.
Good. After, when I again folded into the hospital when I was trying to be a Cambridge student at Newnham, I was very lucky in my director of studies, who had come from the college in Oxford that I had so precipitately left, and she understood exactly the system they were working, and she understood what it had done to me in a way that no one else ever did. And she sent for me and gave me cream in my coffee and said, "My dear, I'm going to send you away because it took me 20 years to get back to the stage of being able to write after going through this Oxford process. And if it took me 20 years, I'm afraid it will take you a little while, and you haven't got 20 years in the period of an undergraduate degree. But come back when you want and see me, and I shall try and help with whatever you're doing." So she could not have been kinder. So I went away, and after a bit I got a bit better, and I saw there was a new historian at Newnham, Dr. Esther Moyer, who was giving a course of lectures on local history in down Mill Road in the slums as they then were. And I approached the chapel in which she was giving these lectures, but on the first occasion, just to find out what this new historian at Newnham was like. And at the last minute I panicked and turned round and bolted. And quite literally, Esther picked me out of the gutter because I was running along the gutter, and the door of this chapel flew open, and a woman stood in the doorway calling, said, "Dr. Moyer saw you going away and says you must come in." So that was my introduction to Esther, and I thoroughly enjoyed her lectures. I swore that I must not say a word. I thought it would be very unhelpful if I said a word. So I sat at the back and said not a word until I think the fourth lecture, which was quite continent of me, I suppose. And then I asked a question. And of course that was fatal, and she beckoned me out to the front at the end of the lecture and said, "What are you doing here?" So I told her. She obviously went back to college and checked for next time. And then she said, after one of her lectures, "I think it would be nice if you did a little bit of research. I think you might enjoy original documents." So I asked my friend, who was Claire Cross, who was the new young county archivist then, and the first full-time county archivist in Cambridgeshire. I asked my friend whether she'd teach you a little paleography, and so if you go up to the Shire Hall and see her any afternoon, she'd be glad to do that. So I was launched on what turned into an entry for the John Nichols Prize at Leicester, from which Esther had just come. She was one of Herbert's previous pupils. I didn't win that prize, I was proximately accessed for it, but Herbert Finberg sent for me and sat me down and said, "Now, tell me about your life, what are you going to do with it?" And he said, "This isn't quite publishable, but one could work on it. But I think you've chosen an inferior village with bad records, so it might be as well to abandon it. And then he made me talk about my personal circumstances and so on. And in the end, he said, well, I think you'd better apply for a Leicester Research Scholarship. And then you can do some of these things properly. So I did that, and I was interviewed by a very large panel of persons headed by Lord Adrian, who was then Vice-Chancellor, the late, no,
Chancellor.
3 times back Chancellor. 3 Lord Adrians back he was. And they were extremely nice to me and very unwisely told me that they would give me a research scholarship. But please wait outside, so I took myself off and waited outside. And what I heard through quite a thick door was uproar. And this uproar was of people shouting at each other, was terminated by a crash as somebody's fist hit the table, obviously. And I was told afterwards that what had happened was that Lord Adrian had hit the table and said, we made the rules, we can break them. We told this girl we were giving her a scholarship, we're giving her a scholarship. Right, next.
And so she
And by
researched
this
about
very
it.
narrow crack, I
Now,
squeezed
let's just
back.
remind ourselves about who Finberg was. We're talking about the famous Department of English Local
History
History,
at Leicester.
established at Leicester, and surely established by W.G. Hoskins.
Yes.
And Hoskins went off to Oxford
That's
at a
right.
certain point, and Finberg was his successor, is that
Finberg
right,
was
as a reader, perhaps?
That is no, as a
And
professor.
he became he was a professor.
I think
And he
so.
himself had an unusual background because he was indeed a typographer, the word you've just used, and printer. And we can still see in the Agricultural History Review a much more elegant publication than many. And he had been a professional printer,
Yes.
hadn't he, for his life, with this amateur interest that became his professional one.
That's right. That's absolutely right. He read greats at Oxford and then set up his own private press, the Alcuin Press, in the Cotswolds, until it became, though he said he would print anything from bottle labels to books, so long as it was beautiful.
Yes.
I have one very precious book from the Alcuin Press downstairs, but it's difficult to find one. And then he was bought out by Broadwater and became a typographical consultant, would one say, perhaps. He was a devout papist, and it gave him enormous pleasure that Eyre and Spottiswoode, whom he was advising, printed the coronation service for Her Majesty the Queen, which she gave to the Pope on her visit to Rome.
He had laid it out.
He had laid it out.
Very
So he took up local history while he was fire watching during the war, and that was how he came to have the time to write Tavistock Abbey, which was his book. After that, he did a great deal of translating because obviously he had great, but he was a very fluent Latinist, and he was interested in translating both the breviary and private prayers, and he continued also to. He's never thought of nearly as jazzily as Hoskins. He never wrote a book that had that impact. But he continued to foster the study of local history, and his piece on the definition of local history is, I think, a wonderful piece. It was the first of the occasional papers which he founded, and he collected dropouts like myself, and some perfectly reasonable people who had not been dropouts.
And of course this department had for a long time on its staff Joan Thirsk, who was tempted there, I think, in the early 50s.
It had Joan Thirsk as reader in...
Was she still there when you went?
Oh yes, in reader in agricultural history, and Alan Everett, who is another man who gets forgotten,
Yes.
in partly because of his own state of health, which has kept him housebound for a long time now.
Yes.
And Alan Everett as reader in urban history.
Yes.
So they made quite a formidable, very small, but quite a formidable team.
Quite.
And they had quite a large number, I don't know how many, part-time research students coming from here, there and everywhere, including regularly one every year from Japan, which has led me on further in my later life in doing things with Japan. The local history library was in the Hatton room, and there was always the click of an abacus going on in the Hatton room, because the current Japanese research student would be doing his sums. And I came to suspect abacuses, perhaps I'm being a bit prolix, but my year, the man who I conceived a great affection for, the man clicking away at his beads was working, I think this may be too personal, was working on the estates of the Countess of Devonshire, and in the 13th century, I think. And when he'd gone away, Herbert flipped his typescript across his desk to me and said, "Margaret, cut that by 2/3, put in all the definite and indefinite articles, and then I can publish it in the whatever it was, society.
Devonshire Association.
And I'll pay you £30, he said, which of course was quite a large sum, but it wasn't very large. I had no idea what was involved, and on almost every page there was a table, and I left it to the very end. There was a master table that tabulated the results of all the tables, and I left it to the very end. I thought, I won't check these tables, I've seen them made, and then I thought, no, I'd better check the last one. So I did. It didn't add up across, it didn't add up down. Then I tried crossways and all sorts, and that was when I found what a great editor could really be like, because I rang up Herbert and said, "Help, this has happened, what do I do?" And he said, "Cut out all the total columns and all the tables."
Very good. So nothing did you to add up at all?
No.
Yes.
I can't
Very
think-
good.
Well, very
So
good.
now you didn't live in Leicester. So you went up there and you
No.
sort of think, well, the seminars. And did you had no connections outside the local history department? It was quite separate, was it, from the beginnings of economic history? So you didn't have anything to do with, say,
Quite
Jim Dios,
No,
and
no.
Ralph Davis came as the professor when it became a separate department in the quite early 60s. Those were separate empires
Those were
Did you
quite
meet Geoffrey Martin in the main history department? Not
in history. Yes,
Yes, but
he was interested in places in local history.
indeed he was. By accident, the Martins became friends. I don't think there was never any official seminar link, or it just happened very agreeably. Now, indeed, I have a Martin godson. I was very glad to know the Martins. No, you see, even then, when I was, as it were, approaching normality through a crack in the door, I was also living with my much reduced mother in Cambridge and looking after her. And it was difficult I couldn't be resident in Leicester.
Right.
So what I had one term in residence before my marriage, when my sister coped, and of course we had to cope, arrange for my mother when I did marry, because the situation wouldn't go on quite that full. One term in residence was amazing. Herbert himself came up from London from Monday to Thursday, I think. And his preferred means of supervising me, whom he hardly knew, of course, and I wasn't the easiest person to get to know, perhaps, was to take me out to dinner on Wednesday night. And first of all, he tried gently probing me about my knowledge of wine, which was utterly non-existent, because my mother, after her stroke, had been revealed as a primitive Methodist, and her father had taken her down to Sunderland docks on a Saturday night to show her the evils of drunkenness, and she never ever forgot. So, I knew nothing about wine, and in the end I told Herbert that this was why he found my palate slightly inadequate, and he started to teach me about wine, and then also, he was the most stimulating person to work with. He had he was impeccable. He wrote in specially made brown ink in an italic hand.
Very beautiful. I have
Very
one or two
beautiful.
letters from him myself.
I have a
Works of art. You've got a number.
Yes, and he also had this sense of timing. If I ever overran a deadline, I would say to myself, unless I'm very quick, Herbert will write this week. And so he did. My sense of guilt and his sense of appropriate reproach were exactly synchronized. But his conversation was so wide-ranging that it was those Wednesday nights may sound very, very superficial, but they weren't. They were in fact very wide-ranging and very educational. And although he knew nothing about my 16th and 17th century interests, he would ask the most exploring questions. And so he was in fact a very good supervisor, though he knew nothing of the subject.
When he was president, I think he must have been of the Agricultural History Society, and we had a trip to Dublin. I remember Finberg saying, he said, we've got to go to the Abbey Theatre tonight. And I said, what's on? He said, I haven't found out yet, but he said, we've only got this night and we're going to go. And I think Jocelyn Finberg was there. And how I got caught, I think perhaps I was the only other agricultural historian who was interested in the theatre or something. And so we went off and we saw a wonderful farce by Boucicault, about which Finberg was remarkably knowledgeable.
Yes.
And I realised that, of course, he looked to be a sort of quiet, scholarly, old-fashioned thing, had these very wide interests,
He read
but everything had to be
enormously.
right, because he, if anything, I mean, if there was a comma that was wrong, or people said an inappropriate thing, he was capable of putting them down.
Absolutely so. And his editor for his own volume, The Agrarian History of England, which he founded as a concept and then put through as an editor before Joan Thirst took over. His editor at the CUP said he was the most nightmarish customer, client, whatever the word is, that she had ever had, because he had these incredibly high standards of typography.
But when you say you got into this crack in the door, you of course in fact landed on your feet, because here were a lot of other people interested in places, not in some antiquarian tradition, but in a comparative dimension that threw light on the way in which people made their livings in different structures, and it was just the right intellectual environment, no?
Absolutely, yes. But a lot of these questions I'd already started to ask in my essay for the John Nichols Prize. I can't quite remember how I couldn't do a PhD, I could only do an MA because I had no first degree. I can't remember quite the margins, the distinction between the essay I've written for the John Nichols and my MA. But
what was your MA about?
My MA was about particularly 16th century Cambridgeshire and agricultural developments there. When Peter and I came to talk, we should perhaps tell you about how we came to meet each other. And to do this, I started out by analysing the whole of only South Cambridgeshire, not the Fens, not the Isle of Ely. I started by analysing the whole of the 1524-5 Great Subsidy for all the villages in South Cambridgeshire, and then I mapped them, and the geographical influences on me were strong too. And I observed there were patterns. They were rough patterns, but there were patterns thrown up by the taxation, which were quite strong from region to region. And somehow that background, which I then took on to the hearth tax, and repeated the experiment with the hearth tax, and found I had the same patterns, with some shifts over time, of course, developing. I thought I should use as the matrix for particular case studies, so that I could pick out villages which were definitely typologically different from each other. And that is what I started to do in my MA and continued to do in what turned into contrasting communities. And Leicester was, of course, the ideal place to feed this, but it wasn't fed me by Leicester. It was just a wonderful cultivation ground. And again, I owed much to Esther Moyer because she focused, of course, W.G. Hoskins' Midland Peasant was the latest thing out round about then. And Esther reviewed it, and reviewed it very well, of course. It is a splendid book. But she finished that review by saying, if I have one criticism to make, it is that this book is really about that abstraction economic man. And I would have liked to see more about the influence of the church, the chapels, if they had any influence. I would like to know more about, and now these were things that I wanted to know more about.
Yes.
I always start, I had by then trained myself always to start with an examination of taxation to pick out what looked like the normal for the area. And how you chose a normal became very important to me. And then I looked at soil maps and the geology and so on. And so I ended up in contrasting communities working on 3 geographically distinct villages, one on the fen edge, one on the clay, and one on the chalk uplands. And they did what that, to me, conclusively demonstrated, that exercise, was that villages in different environments developed socially different patterns. And that to some extent taxation could act as a key to these.
So these interests are, so to speak, homegrown and evidence-driven. You weren't secretly reading Annales at night?
Do you know, I wasn't. You see, there wasn't time. I still had my mother to look after.
Yes.
And then I got married, not that I looked after my husband much. But when we had our first child, when we had our second child, we discovered that I had this really very, very restrictive bone disease, which was generalized. And so life became a juggling exercise between my work, my babies, my marriage, and how do I get up and learn to walk again?
Yes.
So it was quite complicated, and what it didn't permit was general reading. So I'm ashamed to say that I only, if you look very carefully at contrasting communities, which delights me by still being in print in e-books, you will find that I have slapped a quotation from La Durie at the top of the introduction or the preface or whatever it is. And I only read that after finishing the book and submitting it to the press. So I didn't read Annales. I didn't read anything actually. Except documents.
Right.
All my work has been document driven.
Yes.
That's why Peter has books downstairs in this huge house. I have 12 filing cabinets.
Full of Xerox.
Full of Xerox.
Now, I think you know my former student David Mitchell,
Yes.
who had an unusual part to history because he for many years was an architect. But he said to me, one of the grandest things a research student's ever said to me, though it's true he was a little older than me, he said, I've had to give up reading secondary sources. He said, they're so unreliable.
Well, that's true. That is true. And furthermore, one can't convey the essence of people once one has begun to grasp it. And begun is the only type of verb one can use. one can't convey the essence of the people except at first hand, I think. That's why, on the whole, my principal documentation has been wills, after all the normal things for a village, because since I've only had one diary, and that was from a clergyman, so he was out at the top of my social world. So my people weren't diary makers, they wrote wills, or somebody else wrote wills for them. And so these became the only personal evidence I ever had of the inclinations, beliefs, disposition towards wife, children, etc., 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 of one individual. And I really have built my work, I think, on a network of thumbnail sketches. Do you want me to go on?
Yes, I do. I think it's absolutely fascinating. Now, do you think that your gender has helped you in that sort of approach to that sort of history? Because I rather think that Joan Thirsk, for example, would say yes, that women have special insights into these sort of ways of living.
Joan and I agree that women think and write slightly differently from men. And I think this has been demonstrated in Cambridge, but Peter will no doubt tell us, because despite the fact that all candidate scripts are now numbered, not named, so you should not be able to tell the sex of the candidate, in fact you can, because a woman's approach is recognisably different and recognisably less acceptable to many male examiners. And of course there were too few women examiners. Now, it is noticeable.
I don't know if that's noticeable in London.
No?
At least in my department, gender has never been an issue, because right going back to Pollard's day in the first decade of the last century, we've always had a department that was 50% men and 50% women. And I don't know that it would spring out at me which was which.
Lucky you. I mean, the departmental mix, that's marvellous. No, I'm sorry, I'm going to need something to drink. Can you?
At Keele, I had an all-male department.
Yes.
Apart
That's
from
right.
Margaret
They-
occasionally standing in when people were ill or died suddenly.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
They gave me an honorary lectureship at Keele, for which they paid me £50 a year, after Contrasting Unities came out. And they employed me when somebody
Honorary
was
means
on
you got £50 a year.
Yes.
Yes.
When somebody, they employed me when the early medievalists went on sabbatical. I don't know why the 17th century historians didn't accept me. And also
That was
when...
the Finberg influence.
Probably. Also when somebody had a heart attack in the middle of finals and died, they employed me quite suddenly to mark
A lot of script.
a lot of script. And that happened to be mighty inconvenient, because I then had a baby 3 weeks old, and the length of a candidate's answer and the length of the baby's feeding time did not coincide, so I was constantly going back to the beginning of the question just to make sure I'd done the candidate justice.
Yes. Yes.
But in general, was it a help? I think one pays more attention to what many men would call minor details. I think one is more likely to pick up quirks of personality. And there is in that sense a different approach.
Mm-hmm.
It's more people orientated, in fact. Now, I have always tried to... There are also considerable disadvantages, which I really can't assess accurately, because the whole thing was complicated for me by living in a plaster cast for quite long periods of time, and is complicated now when I could be slacking off because I'm really virtually housebound. So it's difficult to make a fair appraisal, but I think my overall appraisal is that women and men seem to me to be roughly parallel and on an entirely equal footing, apart from this business of whether they do or not conceptualise differently, until about 25 when they finish their PhDs. And then that comes the trouble as far as I have observed, because a young woman of 25 and a young man of 25 are thinking this is the marriage age, or the permanent partner age possibly. And so, for the man, I think it's then relatively straightforward, providing he doesn't fall into some emotional pit or other. And if there are any jobs, which of course there haven't been for quite a long time, or not many. Whereas for the young woman, the next 10 years, the decade 25 to 35, is absolutely essential for childbearing. And those two things are in direct conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you're willing to have children and have them brought up by a nanny, which I was not. Nor was Peter.
My dear friend Penny Caulfield,
yes,
said to me some years ago that her greatest regret, she'd had quite a successful and conventional academic career, but she said to me some years her greatest regret was that she had never had children. But then she said, but in order to have had children, I would have had to have a wife.
Yes, quite.
Which I thought was a very revealing
Yes.
analysis.
Yes, it is. And it's perfectly fair.
Or
I think
Carl and Betty Barron's and E.H. Carr.
Now don't tell me they had children.
But they said a couple needs a couple to look after them.
Oh yes.
An academic couple needs a...
I think that takes us slightly sideways.
Yeah.
I think that a woman is really handicapped by this double pull on her feelings. I know that the present trend is for women who adopt a career, as I would have done perfectly straightforwardly by then if I hadn't been having children. Women who do that and are prepared to accept a nanny situation are not bringing up their own children, and they are working extremely hard at both career and children at night. I've lost myself.
Yes, no, it's the difficulties of being a woman,
Yeah.
as well as this with the career. But
No, I know what the trouble is that in order to get launched in a career, more and more women in the last 10 years, I think it's still going on too, are having their first babies at 38, or
yes,
39, or 40.
yes,
And I have known 3 single academic women who quite suddenly haven't been able to bear the approach of their 40th birthdays, and have deliberately gone out and got themselves pregnant,
yes,
because the need to have a child was so great,
yes.
and they'd left it so late, they were prepared to be single parents. That, I think, demonstrates the huge nature of the demand
Yeah.
and the sacrifice that people make when they deny themselves children at the appropriate age. Do I sound very, very...
No, it makes perfectly good sense. But the path, the on the face of it more complicated path that you took, in fact, got you out of a lot of the boring administrative jobs that would have come your way if you'd had a straightforward lectureship. And it can't have stood very much in your way, because you have published quite a lot that's been quite widely read.
Well, I had a considerable battle with myself when our first child was born. To start with, I tried being a full-time mother, and that really wouldn't do because I got bored and then snappy. So after 6 months or so, I reached a sort of halfway house decision, or Peter and I did, more correctly. And I found an excellent Staffordshire cleaning lady who was desperately missing her illegitimate child who'd just been removed from her. grandchild who'd been removed from her on the marriage of its mother. And so she wanted a baby to look after. Well, I had a baby and I wanted it looked after for 2 hours in the morning when it was mostly asleep anyway. So
Inside the house.
in its own house, exactly. So she came in and cleaned for me and looked after our son. And this worked out extremely well, and I had 2 hours. I had 2 hours and 20 minutes every morning. 20 minutes because I had 10 minutes walk to and from the department. And that 2 hours is amazing. It concentrates the mind quite as well as hanging. You know, you can do
Yes.
an awful lot in 2 hours, and I did, and tremendously backed by my husband. And I don't think this would have worked if I hadn't had Peter's huge support and glad support, because he approved of what I was doing.
Yeah.
If there'd been tension between us, it wouldn't have worked, but it wasn't. And so the work did get done, and you're quite right, quite a lot of work got done. And I was saved many chores, which had I been in paid work would have held me up considerably.
what you both have in common, and of course it turns out that you do have overlapping interests, though one might think that you were in rather different fields, but you do share in common the same sort of continuity of interest. That without writing the same work over and over again, because you've approached things in innovative and interesting and comparative ways, but the interests have always been there in contrasting villages and contrasting places,
Yes.
which you've exemplified in an increasing range of ways
Yes.
over the years.
Is there time for me to tell you my grand design, my grand work design?
Have you got a grand design? I see you've written something on a piece of paper.
I wrote it on a piece of paper in case I couldn't remember my grand design.
What have you written?
Well, you see, when I went to Leicester, right back at the beginning, or not at the beginning, in fact, when I went to Leicester, my grand design was to do something about this abstraction economic man, and indeed woman, and turn him into something more substantial. I was particularly interested in his religion and whether he was mixed up in the Reformation, or whether he was just passive and pushed around and told what to do, and also on what went on in the dissenting communities of the 17th century, and where my common people were then, and what they were up to. And by the time I'd established my framework of taxation and normality and picked out my trial villages and done their land distribution, that takes time. And I then was clear to move on to religion and the villager, except that by then I had realised that I couldn't, because I knew nothing about this person's literacy or his wife's literacy either. And unless I knew whether the only influence on them was preaching from the pulpit, and not coming through any written texts, I couldn't really decide at all how involved they were in the changes of the Reformation in the next century. So I had to find out whether they were able to read. And I was much helped by reading there are 140 odd things called spiritual autobiographies, which are very maddening, because they don't give you any of the details of place and exactitude that a historian would like, but they often do say if the child was orphaned and taken out of school, or give some detail of learning to read, which is a very precious skill and completely independent from learning to write. So this meant I could approach my villagers' wills with a new interest. I was working, I should say, not on scribal copies, but on Xerox of originals. So I learnt to recognise their hands, I hoped, and sorted out the scribes concerned in each village I was working on, and found that every scribe leading, as they always did, with a bequest of the testator's soul to God, and these were very sick people. They usually did die 2 or 3 days after the will was drawn up. They bequeathed their souls to God, which always seems to me a rather odd concept theologically, but never mind, they did it. And the individual scribes had different formulae in which they did this. But in any run of one scribe's work, you could find 1 or 2 aberrant ones which were much stronger and quite differently worded. And there I thought you had the voice of the testator coming through.
Yes.
So that was interesting. And having established that, then...
Were these all men, Margaret? Mostly. You have some women's wills.
Some women. Yes, I have some women. Then, after that, I couldn't go straight on to religion. Still, I had to discover what there was available to read. What could these people at the bottom of the social heap obtain to read if they had 2pence spare? And of course, that monstrously nosy man, Samuel Pepys, was a great help, because for 10 years he collected up these chapbooks, cheap books, which were published by a syndicate of printers in London. And they really were the most dreadful little things. They were interesting. Some of them had 13th century origins. The storytelling goes way back, and I spent a long time trying to identify stories. A lot of them were new stories, though, written for the newly literate market of the 1590s, 1600s. And the genre appeared in the 1610 to 20, as a research student of mine later found out. But they were awful. There was so much scatological stuff, so much piss and shit. It was just unbelievable. And I had major problems with writing it up, because I couldn't decide whether this sort of language was ubiquitous to both men and women, would appeal to both men and women. Who was it aimed at, and did this language tell me anything about the intended readership? So I hivered and hovered and hivered, and was much helped by Elizabeth Eisenstein, because I went down, unusually, because I was usually much at home, I went down to a conference where I met her in London, and she said, "My dear," I can't do her voice, "My dear, why are you being so long with your next book?" And I was so surprised, I told her. And she said, "Oh." And then she said, "But dear, you can't stand there, sit there the rest of your life wondering about this. If they told lavatory jokes, you just have to write lavatory jokes down in the paper." So I roughly did that, and was amused when Aylmer reviewed this book and said, "We all have a tendency to call a spade, but does Dr. Spufford really need to call it a bloody shovel?" And I thought, if he knew what I've had to read to write this book, I'd so much quietened it down. Anyway, when I'd got my twopenny books established in their nature, and a large proportion of them were religious, and about damnation. Even then I had to find out whether there was a distribution network. I mean, were these confined to London, or did they get right out into the Pennines? So then I turned to Chapman. This became rather laborious as a way to approach the Reformation. I turned to Chapman and discovered that they did indeed get all around the country, and these small books had a chance of getting all around the country too. So at last I was free to look at the Reformation and the 17th century dissenting sects, and my first chapter, I had a marvellous group of research students. We haven't mentioned research students, but mine were very important to me. After we moved to Cambridge, in the end I collected up 10, and a couple of supervisors were on sabbatical, and they they've made a marvellous group, and we work together a lot I wanted to try and alleviate this loneliness that I think people in the humanities often suffer from. And we wrote a volume together in which I had, as it were, sketched out areas of wall in which they could do their fresco. And I was trying to aim at something on religious opinion amongst the common sort. And my chapter in that was the end of my exploring insofar as I could do it. And I was very sad when the CUP forgot to deliver review copies to everyone. So I greatly fear that book is not. I've never had decent criticism of it. I don't know whether it hit the right level or not. And that was very much my tour de force, I thought. However, it's a funny thing. One goes full circle. I didn't want to go on working on religion after that book, and I was becoming increasingly disturbed by the way that social history seemed to me to be floating off its economic roots. Because as far as I'm concerned, social history really ought to have its feet in the ground, and those essential bits of information about acreages and common fields and all the rest of it just shouldn't be escaped from. I don't like theories about the concept of the body unless I know who this person is.
Yes.
What house he's living in.
Yes.
Whether he has enough to eat.
Yes.
All this sort of stuff.
What he's wearing.
What he's wearing, exactly. Well, I'm in two places at the moment. I'm trying to find out what he's wearing, and I'm also trying to get his feet back into the ground. Because you remember I started with taxation. Because of this alarm about the general trends in social history, I have done the impossible, I think, and tried to tackle the hearth tax at large, that is, over the whole of England and Wales. And I have, these are our volumes in progress, if you want to see the size of the enterprise.
Yes.
And it's large, and I can't get any money for it, which is very relevant.
I thought that Peter had got lots of money in the British Record Society.
No, we don't
this
do
is publishing for
we
me.
don't do the...
These are my pre-publication expenses. And they are considerable. And you know, nobody will give me a grant, nobody except the British Academy. Do you think it's because I'm empirical, or old, or totally out of fashion? I mean, we've got that wonderful series, go right back to, Doomsday Book, Derby. Derby, Glasscock, the woman working on 1381, John Shield on 1524-5, Gap. Nobody could tackle the hearth taxes because they're too big. And yet, they may be too big, but I thought to myself in 1995 when I got my research chair, and my department needed a project, I thought, but I thought, there are these days computers which I can't operate myself. Surely that makes a difference.
No.
It ought to be possible to crack it
Yes.
with computers.
Yes.
And this is what we're trying to do. I'm quite the wrong person to try and do it. But on the other hand, this absence of an analysis of the best records we have for the 17th century is really bugging me.
Yes.
So I am trying to do something about that, but no one will give me money except the British Academy.
The VCH, which as you well know has been dogged by difficult financing for over a century.
That it was...
But it's now got a lot of heritage funding money.
Has it?
And it's transforming the VCH. Mind you, it takes an enormous amount of time because the new director of VCH, John Beckett, tells me that he spends his entire time in committee meetings trying to report on funds. But I don't know if you approve of the word heritage and the current heritage industry, but there's a lot going for it. And I don't know if, I've just no idea whether they would be a source of funding, because all these county volumes, you've got Kent there, you made me buy Kent, and it's a wonderful volume.
Yes, you like it.
I do.
I'm so glad.
I do.
The
I'm so glad.
heritage.
I've done heritage at a missed service and have lied actually. The only people apart from the Academy to give me money are heritage.
Oh.
And of course the Mark Fitch Fund, which has stood gallantly by me through year in, year out, thick and thin, but really does feel that it supported enough of my work. And I don't know, it gave me 15,000 for 3 years, 4 years ago, and I'm wondering whether I dare go back to it. Because now I have good accounts. Anyway, that's one thing I'm doing. The other thing I'm doing, which you won't consider frivolous, but which most historians do, of course, and Joan Thirsk would add most male historians do, is something about clothing.
This is your probate accounts.
Yes.
Because as you know, roughly a quarter of domestic expenditure seems to have gone on clothing. Half on food, quarter on clothing. And this is no inconsiderable sum. And I finished my first chapter in the summer. I discovered I had neglected that you'd written, the history of dress has usually been approached without any numbers. What should characterize the economic historian is a statistical sense, the habit of asking in relation to any institution, policy, group or movement, the questions how large, how long, how often, how representative.
It's Clapham. It's kind of you to say it's me. It's me quoting Clapham.
Is it you quoting Clapham?
Yes.
I better sort it out then. Where does it stop? Economic historians have addressed such questions to the wool trade, the cloth trade, to textile factories, to all aspects of the production and distribution of what clothes are made from, but they have shied away from attempting to address their statistical questions to clothes themselves.
That's me. That is me.
Good, I thought it was. Leaving the field to a lucky dip of historians with artistic, psychological or sociological concerns, and that was certainly you. Anyway, my last research student was absolutely superb, so much so that I said, would you, since your thesis is more than half this book, would you like to be the joint author with me? And now she is working on her half. And I very much hope that we shall get it together in a reasonable time. The research is done.
We've got to stop at that point,
Right.
because we've got to Spufford in a minute, but we're starting outside his house. Here is it's the old Guildhall, Peter.
Yes.
Say something about it.
Right, it's the Guild of St John the Baptist, which was a parish guild, which we know existed in the 14th century. It spent most of the 15th century building itself a chapel and a church. And at the end of the 15th century, it built itself a new Guildhall, which is what we have in front of us. It's basically one huge room upstairs for the confraternity to meet, and downstairs miscellaneous rooms whose function we're not at all clear about.
Well, let's switch the machine off and go inside and talk properly.
The meeting's 5 centuries ago.
How splendid. Well, we're getting there. Very good.
A bedroom in which we are packing to go away next week. But you look up and it's an astonishing looking up, and you can see what is 1970.
How
and
long
what
is
is
it that you lived here?
How long? About 12 years.
How splendid. Now, where? I'm Negley Harte, and it's the 21st of October, 2005, and I'm in Whittlesford. Am I in Whittlesford? Whittlesford.
W-H-I.
Just outside Cambridge, in the splendid old Guildhall, where Peter and Margaret Spufford live. And I have with me Giorgio Riello behind the camera, and just off the camera for the moment is Margaret Spufford, who I shall be talking to later, but she may interrupt with corrections if I get things, or Peter gets things wrong in the meantime. But I'm starting first with Professor Peter Spufford. Now, I think you came up to Cambridge as an undergraduate 2 years over half a century ago.
Yes, 1953.
In 1953, which is quite a good innings. Now, to what extent and in what sense were your interests as a historian already established by the time you came up as a student in 1953?
Well, I hadn't done history at school except for the last year, because I had intended to read maths, and my maths in the end wasn't good enough to bring in any scholarship money. So I went to my headmaster and said, what should I do? So he talked about my interests, and I was already interested in coin collecting. I'd already founded the local numismatic society in Bath and talked on the radio on coins. I was already interested in genealogy and had got my ancestors back to the beginning of the 16th century. I was interested in churches and church architecture, and I was the Assistant Secretary of the Bath Heraldic Society, and a whole variety of things, and it converged to make history the obvious thing to do. So I had just 1 year of history at school, and the man who taught me at school had done a master's degree in Manchester and was hooked on the Middle Ages, so I became hooked on the Middle Ages through him. So I already had interests in coinage, or rather in money, because I was already interested in money supply.
Where did this interest in coins originate? You had it as a teenager already, quite strongly,
already,
obviously.
yes. I think when I was about 8 or 9, somebody gave me a George III cartwheel tuppence, and I was hooked on that. And I started spending my pocket money as a schoolboy on buying coins, and I was intending to try and make a collection of one coin of every ruler from the Conqueror onwards.
And did you succeed?
No. There are rare rulers like Stephen, whom I never bought. And in fact, the coin which I thought was William I has now been reattributed to William II. And I don't think I have anything of either Henry I or Stephen. That was a period of very low minting, as I later discovered. I didn't know at that point that in fact there had been more money about in late Anglo-Saxon England than there was in, let us say, early 13th century England. That was something I discovered much later.
So there were these various historical interests that came together before you'd actually studied history in any formal way at all, which
That's
you
right.
took up in your last year at school.
Yes, because I had done higher in maths and French, having other things I'd done in the sixth form with things like physics and German.
Right, so this is a slightly unusual path to being a history undergraduate at Cambridge. But your interests were already pronounced in the Middle Ages.
Yes, that was certainly true already.
So you went to Jesus College.
Yes,
as
because
an
they gave
undergraduate.
me an award, they took me out of the pool.
But you didn't in any way fall under the influence of Charles Wilson.
I did indeed, he was my director of studies. So I had two historians to teach me in Jesus. I had Vivian Fisher, who was a medievalist, and Charles Wilson, who was modern, but also economic history. And I think it was Charles Wilson who made me into an economic historian.
Mm-hmm.
That combined with my interest in money and money supply and that sort of thing. And what Charles did to me, I can remember my very first term, he gave me Brodel's La Méditerranée to read in French, with the expectation that I would be able to read this, amongst other books, in a week. I might say I never read the political part of La Méditerranée, I read the rest. But I was very much taken by Brodel at that very point, that formative point.
In this type of very broad-based
broad-based history, and indeed what was fascinating was that my last book, Power and Profit, one of the readers wrote back and said it reminded him of Brodel writing on capitalism and material life for a later period, which I thought was a very nice sort of feel of the 50 years in between that I was of that period of time. And Vivian Fisher made me read La Société Féodale, also in French. I mean, these things were not then translated. I mean, people didn't translate in those days within months or even years. It was several decades before things got translated.
I wouldn't myself have necessarily expected that Charles Wilson would have given you Brodel to read as early as 1953.
It was new. It was very new.
It was new, and he had interests in the Mediterranean and France, did he too, besides his obviously more orthodox Dutch interests.
Oh yes. He taught me all sorts of economic history. It wasn't purely Dutch, I can remember. And I mean, it was he who actually introduced me to Carlo Cipolla, not Philip Grierson, strangely enough. And no, Charles introduced later on. Charles became first professor in Florence when the University Institute was established, and invited me out there to give lectures and things. So no, Charles was a European historian in a very wide way, although he had made his reputation in the Netherlands and most of his writing was about the Netherlands. He did general things at that point. If you remember, we had balance of payments crises going on in the contemporary world at that period of time. And what did he do? It sparked off people writing about mercantilism and earlier people playing with balance of payments crises. And he and Heckscher were heavily involved in that.
Yes, of course. Now,
so he got me to read Heckscher.
Should you perhaps explain the confusion about what was to be your area of research and the way that Cipolla came in and went out again?
well, I was just about to ask about research.
Yes.
There you were studying history in this various ways,
Yes.
And then you must have graduated and you became a research student. What determined what you were going to work on? You just mentioned Philip Grierson.
Right. I worked with Philip Grierson. I went to see Philip Grierson, who I went to hear lecture on Europe and the outside world in the Middle Ages. There was a subject at that point in time on Europe and the outside world, with lots of travel stuff, which was going across Asia, missionaries and so forth, but it involved economic things of one sort or another. So you had, for example, a letter home from Zaitur in South China by a Franciscan missionary saying, at the Emperor's largesse, according to the Genoese merchants here, is worth so much. So I suddenly saw Europe as part of Eurasia.
Global history.
Yes, global history was there, and I hope that in all my writing I have been conscious of Europe as only a part of a much wider world.
Yes.
You find in my money book there is stuff about West Africa, and in the trade book obviously lots of stuff about Asia.
But in identifying what it was that you were going to do research on when you were a research student, because you've leapt on to how your interests have grown up from these seeds, but where did they...
Right, I went to Philip Grierson because of my interest in coinage and money, and said to him, I would like to do research with you, what should I work on? And he said, well, the thing to work on which most need doing is something on 15th century Italy. The coinages of 15th century Italy need a great deal of unravelling, and how this fits in with the economy at the time. And I thought, ooh, that sounds fascinating, and I went off to Italy and I took a course in Italian at the British School in Florence, and I went to Venice where I'd been given Carlo Cipolla's address by Philip Grierson. He wasn't there. I hadn't done anything.
He was at Berkeley in California.
Probably not yet.
Not yet, no.
And I probably didn't do the sensible thing like warn him I might be coming in any way. I just went and tapped on the door and there was nobody about, and patently nobody about. So I came back rather sadly to Cambridge, and Philip Grierson said, it's no good. Carlo Cipolla has just got a huge amount of money from Italian banks and is accumulating a team of people to work on that. Forget it. So I said, well, what's the second most economically developed area of Europe? Is the Low Countries. So he said yes, and of course he is fascinated by the Low Countries. He did his own, he never did a doctorate, but he did his immediate postgraduate research on Flanders, and so I worked with him on the monetary policies of the Low Countries, not particularly on the coinage, but on the monetary policies of the 15th century Netherlands, from the unification of the coinage in 1433 until the 1490s.
Right. So you plunged in to matters that you were already interested in as a teenager and that have interested you for the rest of your life.
Absolutely. And he put me in contact with Hans von Verwecker in Ghent. Now, Hans was obviously the prize pupil of Henri Pirenne, so in some sense I am an academic grandchild of Pirenne, which is a lovely thought. And Hans von Verwecker introduced me into this whole milieu of the fascination with urban history in the Low Countries, and I met his fellow researcher at the same time as, for example, was Walter Prevenir, with whom I have kept up ever since. And then the other group of people were working in Louvain under von Hooter, whom I was sent across to see, and his prize research students were Herman von de Wey and Raymond von Uitven, and I have kept up with them ever since. So I made a Belgian group of people through Philip Grierson's colleges. But I also had to work in the northern Netherlands, what becomes the present day Kingdom of the Netherlands, and so I had introductions to people from Charles Wilson, who sent me across to see Posthumus, for example, in Amsterdam. Who was
And did you get to know Posthumus?
not very well. I had one long, fascinating afternoon with him, like I had a long, fascinating afternoon with Ganshoff. I didn't get to know him very well, and I was not conscious, I think, at that point that he was building up this extraordinary archive and founding this Institute for Economic and Social History, Economic and Social History in Amsterdam, which is so good for all sorts of documentation.
Now, the great professor of economic history in Cambridge, surely at this time, was Moody Apostle.
Yes.
And he was a medievalist and very international in his interest. Was he any sort of influence on you?
Not surprisingly, because for some reason or other there were no medieval lectures from him. I did go to him when he was lecturing about the 19th and 20th centuries. And so it wasn't the medieval grain market I heard about from him, but the Chicago grain market. It was very different, not what you expect at all. The other economic historians, the brightest of the young economic historians was David Jocelyn, who after all then succeeded to that chair and then died very young. But he gave the most remarkable lectures on the Industrial Revolution. And you know how a lecture audience starts large and gets thinner and thinner and thinner.
I think perhaps that appendix you wrote for Boston.
I'll come back to Boston in a moment. But David Jocelyn...
Kept his audience.
No, it grew.
It grew.
He was then a research fellow, and he was given quite a small room to lecture in, as I remember doing myself when I was a research fellow. One had a small room. It filled. So, the next week, people were sitting all over the floor. The week after, he had a bigger room. The week after that, people were sitting all over the floor. And he moved 3 times to bigger and bigger rooms. And, for example, Herbert Butterfield started with a huge audience, and it shrank to practically nobody. He's such a boring lecturer. But David Jocelyn, talking about the Industrial Revolution and the factors in it, was absolutely fascinating. And we were all hooked and brought in our neighbours.
Yes. I'm very glad you mentioned David Jocelyn. He was very kind to me and an awfully nice man. Welsh charm, of course. And because he's published so little, the generations of students looking at this interview won't have him leaping out at them as an influence, because is the one. There's one or two articles in the little book about banking in Latin America,
That's all.
which is very sad. Now, so you were a research student in Cambridge and you became a research fellow, but then you went off to the University of Kiel.
Yes.
Now, was there much economic history at Kiel? Is there some sort of R.H. Tawney,
No.
WEA
There is
tradition?
indeed an R.H. Tawney WEA tradition, and in fact the original building for the humanities was the Tawney building, in fact. But no, it wasn't economic history very much that was taught. In fact, when I went there, with a very tiny department, Kiel was intended as a university of 600 people. Remember, it's founded in 49 by the Attlee government. Attlee and Tawney were obviously influences heavily behind the scene. And that was a time when places like Leicester, Hull, Southampton all had 600 to 800 students. So Kiel at 600 was a little, sort of the bottom of that level.
But it was founded on a different plan to those other ones, which were more orthodox, weren't they?
Yes.
And there was some idea of a foundation year, or some idea of what later perhaps became called interdisciplinary studies.
Yes.
Rather than packing people off into honours schools of history and geography and so on.
The intention was that it should be a place for educational experiments, and if the educational experiments worked, they should then be sold on to other universities, and a new experiment should be tried. But in fact, only one experiment was tried, and that was by having a foundation year in which people started off with the Big Bang, or whatever was then the thing. It must have been the Hoyle time. It must have been the expanding universe,
Yes.
that sort of universe that was being peddled, rather than the Big Bang that comes a little bit later, running right on through the geologists, the ancient historians, the medievalists, and I had a whole week of lectures from the end of Rome through to the 16th century. And when, for example, you had Peter Laslett and who was the other person with the Open University at the beginning? They thought of taking the Kiel Foundation year into the Open University Foundation year, and they turned up and they found they had a whole week of Spufford. And they didn't take the Kiel Foundation year as the Open University Foundation year. But it obviously it had some influence on the way they were thinking.
Because these lectures were not for students of history. They were for students.
These were for all students. Did an initial year when they did everything.
Yes.
So it was from pre-Plato to post-NATO, as it were.
Yes.
And it ended up with the scientists talking about the Nobel Prizes of that year.
Yes. And
so all students did that, and then they made their choice of two principal subjects.
I thought then they altered their choice.
Oh yes, they said before they arrived what they thought they were going to do.
Yes.
And afterwards they actually made the real choice of what they were going to do, and the majority of them changed one of their subjects, and a large minority changed both.
And if you had a lot of lectures, and you contributed this great chunk of European history, did they have classes or discussion, tutorial discussion?
Yes, they had.
And how was that handled? Because were you very adept at talking about the latest Nobel Prizes yourself?
Well, it was very interesting. We had foundation year discussion groups, which had 3 academics, one from the humanities, one from the social sciences, one from the sciences, and a group of, I can't remember how many, 15 undergraduates, so that one or the other of us could cope with most things.
Right.
The way it worked out. So
And this famous experiment at Kiel carried on for quite a long time, several decades.
Oh,
but
yes.
then dribbled out because there's not much of it left. Am I right? It's become more conventional.
It became much more conventional. What happened was the university decided, just about the time I arrived there, to expand to the enormous size of 3,000 students. and the problem was how to fund 3,000 students on 4-year courses. We managed to get that passed, but then the problem was, can you go any bigger than that? And the answer was no. We couldn't get government funding, and eventually you had two lots of people, those who were just doing 3-year courses and those who were doing 4-year courses, and the pressures meant that people drifted into mostly doing 3-year courses, and eventually the whole thing stopped. Which was very sad because I found it very exciting to teach.
Mm-hmm.
Or I also did things like teach economic history, as it happened, to people who were not going to do a principal subject in history, but were going to do something quite different. You had to do, as it were, a distant minor in American terminology. So I had people who were doing quite other things, and I offered them a course which gave them the commercial revolution of the Middle Ages, the price revolution of the 16th century, and the Industrial Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And so I taught.
Yes.
That sort
But
of
then
thing.
this, and all those, and that was an earlier experiment than, say, Sussex, which tried to start in the early 60s. With,
That's right.
I think they had 3 years, but they tried to get rid of departments and tried
Yes.
to be interdisciplinary. And then they gradually became more and more conventional, did they not?
That's
There
right.
was this big drive, of course,
And
it's for
again-
3 years with its financial
Yes.
implications. as
Again,
you rightly
with
say.
the Open University people came to look at Kiel and see what could be taken. The Sussex people came to look at Kiel and
Yes.
took what we had done and said, no, we can do that better by trying to integrate things rather than make people do two separate columns.
Yes. Now, there came a point when you came back to Cambridge.
Yes.
You didn't leave Kiel with any disgust at them failing to continue to be experimental, or
No, it was that, well, I arrived as the most junior of junior assistant lecturers and ended up as head of department. And I didn't have a chair there, but the papers were being prepared for a chair, and I knew that in a chair department, a small one-chair department, the head of department, professor, had a huge administrative load, and in order to keep going in a small university, he had to sit on all the key committees to fight for his corner. And I had already had some experience of this. I sat on the University Senate, I sat on policy staffing and development, I sat on the research committee, and I knew I was going to have to go on doing that. I would have to get myself onto the council. And I suddenly saw myself with an endless horizon. 7 years, it was been 7 years as head of department, renewable for another 7 most likely. And I knew I could do it, but I knew that if I did it, I wouldn't.
do other things that you wanted to do.
That's right. So it was a matter of choices.
So Cambridge was, well, it was back to Cambridge.
It
which
was
you
back to
obviously had been
Cambridge. It
attached.
was dropping down.
But it enabled you to do what you wanted.
Yes, I mean, at Kiel I had a
It didn't.
I will come back to that. No, I had a readership at Kiel with the head of department allowance, but I had a professorial salary, and I dropped back to an ordinary lecturer's salary in order to have access to the university library and so forth. What I didn't know, because I only had a lecturer's salary, I had to take up a college fellowship. 7 colleges asked me whether I would like to come to them, and I looked at them and I chose Queen's because it seemed to have the nicest people. Financial things were all much of a muchness. What I didn't know was that the young man who was Director of Studies was going to go away. So I suddenly found I was Director of Studies, and I found it harder work organising 36 undergraduates in Cambridge than 360 in Kiel, because I had a super secretary at Kiel.
Right. And you didn't in
Cambridge.
in Cambridge.
But on the other hand, I did write more all the same. I did finish my books, the
Yes.
things that I had started on. I had already at Kiel started on the exchange rates, on the money book, on the trade book near its beginning. My 3 main things had already started.
Right. Now, I don't know at what point you became involved, or to what extent indeed you did become involved in the affairs of the Economic History Society. You never held office in that society.
I never held office.
But you must have gone to the odd conference, perhaps.
Yes, I'm trying to think when I first went to...
Sweden.
Yes, Sweden is the first international conference I ever went to was in Stockholm.
This must be about 1960.
That was 1960, and that was the Economic History Conference, the very first of them, at which Earl Hamilton, who'd written so extensively on Spanish silver and the price rise, came to expound and to be acclaimed as the great man. What he didn't expect was that, starting with a young Swedish lecturer, Ingrid Hammerstrom, he would be bitterly attacked, and people would put up real history, real factors, as opposed to monetary factors in the price revolution, and make the point that the real price rise was greater, say, in the Netherlands than in Spain, and a variety of things like this, because the greater population.
Which all pointed to population pressure rather than
That's right.
Latin American silver.
So he was attacked, starting with her, by a whole lot of other people, including Poston.
Yes.
And he went away very unhappy. He took the next plane back to Chicago, having failed to be applauded greatly. So that was my first... I must have gone to economic history conferences myself before that.
But your stronger memories, revealingly, are of the series of international conferences
Yes.
that then began to meet every, I forget,
4 or 5 years,
4 or
something
5
like that.
years. And they split off from the Historical
main
Congress, or whatever
That's
it's
right.
called.
It was attached at the
And there
same
were separate
time,
ones,
so
yes.
1960.
And so you went to you went to Leningrad.
I went to Leningrad again with Poston. Well, I forgot to say, Poston didn't influence me. I said as an undergraduate, but as a postgraduate, of course, I went to the Poston seminar, which is now the Hatcher Seminar, on economic history, medieval economic history, and Poston was my internal examiner for my PhD.
Ah.
So, and Poston always, though I was never a research student of his, he always introduced me to people at congresses as his pupil. I have pupils everywhere. He would.
And did you talk to him in St. Petersburg? Well, of course, I suppose it was then still Leningrad.
It was still Leningrad.
There were times when Poston was capable of remembering conversations with Lenin. Whether he indulged in these memories largely thought to be fabricated with you, I wonder.
No, he didn't talk about that at all with me. He talked about, well, on the aeroplane he was just plain frightened. He didn't know whether he was going to be picked up by the NKVD or whatever it was then called, or OGPU, and disappeared. In fact, he was given a marvellous reception. He was treated as a very great Russian. So he was. It didn't work out. But on the way, he was very unhappy. He was sitting next to me and really very apprehensive, and talked about being an undergraduate in St. Petersburg. It wasn't on that occasion, it was another occasion when he talked very revealingly about his childhood in the hinterland of Odessa.
Yes.
Where he was talking, again comes into the grain trade, how the grain trade, he remembers all these grain wagons going down to Odessa, passing his father's house. From the Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe,
Yes.
as it were, was visibly there in front of his own window.
Yes.
Which he
Yes.
talked about eloquently. And this, of course, rang a bell with me, because my mother's grandfather was an Italian, and he ran a grain import business and wrote Black Sea grain tables in the 19th century.
Really?
About the prices of grain being brought round to Bristol.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, aha, this all fits together.
Right.
So-
Did Poston claim that he knew your great
No, he didn't.
grandmother.
He did not. He could have done. I mean, he was quite outrageous in his claims, but no, he did
He
not.
was capable of the most grotesque mistakes. When I was at a seminar setting up which volume of the agrarian history was it, with Herbert Finberg chairing, of course, in the Institute. I think it must have been the 15th century volume, and Poston and Catabine Rosfade fell into a very heated dispute about the amount of pasturage in New Needwood Forest and the implications of this. And this went on for about 10 minutes, and then Poston looked down at his notes and said, "Ah, I see, I have made the mistake. I have added a naught. I'm so sorry." And Herbert cast his eyes to the sky in the most speaking manner. And that was the sort of thing that happened. with
Tenfold
Poston.
error. Yes.
Until Titoff found him, or he found Titoff. And then somebody came up to Keele and reported that Titoff says, of the following 10 itemised ideas of Poston's, these 3 are wrong, these 3 are unprovable one way or the other, and of the remaining 4, 2 are certainly right and 2 are possibly right.
And Titoff, as a research assistant, made things work.
Yes, he did.
But the big book on medieval English agriculture never happened, despite
Great
Titoff.
shame.
No. Yes. Now, as well as being very active with your own research on these topics that you have
Yes.
talked about, you also became very well known for your work for a number of societies.
Yes.
Not so much the Economic History Society, but I think of the British Record Society in particular. Now, what's the origin of your interest and connection there?
Well, that comes out of my interest in genealogy, which started with just an ordinary schoolboy ancestor hunt. And then, as an undergraduate, one needed vacation jobs, and I worked for the research department of the Society of Genealogists as a vacation job. And I then met the people who were running the Society of Genealogists, and it was Mark Fitch, who you know of as a benefactor,
Yep.
who was then chairman of the British Record Society, said, would I like to be secretary of this society? And so I took that on, and that was in 1960, so I've now, for whatever it is, 45 years been associated, first as secretary, then as general editor, and now as chairman. And the British Record Society was then, under Mark's aegis, attempting to see whether it could produce total indexes in print of all testamentary records from before 1700. And a huge quantity of stuff came out. Mark himself produced something like volume 100 in the 100th year of the Society. In fact, volume 101, 102 had already come out, but we gave him volume 100. And so I have an interest in testamentary probate records, which comes from an interest in genealogy. My interest in genealogy was, I became editor of the Genealogist magazine, and then later on I made me a vice president of the Society of Genealogists. And one of the things that came to interest me was mobility of population. Now, this itself was a strange thing. The World Conference on Records in 1969 or something like that, run by the Mormons in Salt Lake City.
Oh, God.
Exactly.
Yes.
And the Mormons came. A man came to the door, actually, at Kiel. A policeman, a Mormon policeman, and said, would I do something on 17th century population mobility? So I said, no, you've come to the wrong person. You want to talk to Mark.
I was just going to say, wasn't he confusing you with your wife?
Exactly. That's what I said to him. No, they said, they wanted me because I was interested in genealogy.
Yeah.
So I wrote on mobility of population for them, which was then published in, where was it published first? Local population studies, was it?
I think so.
Then a larger version went into
Actually, that you did produce with Economic History.
the Genealogists magazine, and then for the conference of the Jubilee Conference, the Economic History Society, I did that paper then on 17th century population mobility, and there was going to be a whole mobility book edited by Malcolm Kitch, and the publisher went bankrupt.
Oh.
So it never got published. But they have a TypeScript at Campot, which they used at one stage quite extensively on population mobility. So that is another side effect of genealogy.
Yes.
I might say I have never chased my ancestors further than I did as a schoolboy. It is still stuck in 1504 or thereabouts.
Now, eventually, of course, you became a Fellow of the British Academy.
Yes.
And you play quite an active role in that. Now, what does that body do for economic history? I use the term economic history in a very wide sense to include all of your interests.
Yes. There are two relevant sections. Well, there are historical sections. No, it's even more complicated than that. There is an economic section, which is economics and economic history, and I'm not in that section. And most of those people are 19th and 20th century economic historians. Then there are historical sections, like the early modern one, in which Margaret is, and the modern history one, where economic historians take their place amongst other people. I'm in the medieval section, which is the whole of medieval society, culture, literature, history, and there are not very many economic historians amongst them. I mean, very newly elected is Richard Britnell, for example. So yes, we have economic historians, but we are amongst other historians. And I think that's one of the things that probably distinguishes being a medieval economic historian from later, that one is generally in a history department, not an economics department or a specialist economic history department, and therefore one has to teach the whole of history. And so my economic history has always been a strand, along with political history, literary history, cultural history, religious history, the lot. So, although it's what I've principally written about, it's not what I've taught about. And the group of people in the academy is again that sort of extraordinary mixture.
And that suits you, of course.
Oh, yes.
As a medievalist. Yeah.
What the academy...
But they don't do much. They do a little publishing.
Oh, yes.
Do you more and more distribute funds?
Yes, the academy. The big distribution of funds has now been hived off, first the Arts and Humanities Research Board and then to the Arts and Humanities Research Council. But the Academy does have funds. It gives funds for research, senior research fellowships, research readerships, very occasionally research professorships, in parallel with what the Royal Society does next door. So I've obviously helped a bit in the selection processes for that. It also gives research grants, not on the grand scale of the Arts and Humanities Research Council or the EHRC, but on the small scale, which are quite useful for things. It also does quite a lot of international exchange work. It also supports the British schools in other places. So, for example, I've lectured at the British School in Rome, and that is something supported by the Academy. The Academy provides the basic finance for that, and in Athens and so forth.
You've left out the research projects, which
Oh,
are
yes.
quite heavily...
I was going to come to them. There are about 40 research projects which are sponsored by the Academy, which gives a sum each year too, not a very large sum of money, but it gives a sponsorship which enables other things to roll. But there's also a publishing end to the Academy. So, for example, I've been to an Academy meeting today, which is the part that's been interesting in me is the publication of the volumes of medieval European coinage. which is a 17-volume set, and we had both the research project man there, Ken Emon, but also James Rivington, the publication man, because the volumes get published through the Academy and the OUP. There is of the specifically economic and social series, which is a research project published by the OU for the Academy by the OUP. I won't tell you what I discovered today, to my surprise.
Oh, what a tease.
I'm sorry, cut that bit out.
Oh, a brief censored passage.
Yes. But yes, economic history is there, but as far as I'm concerned, it's amongst other things.
Yes, and so the Academy is to be seen as doing a range of useful things.
Oh,
and
very
of course
much
it's
so.
increasingly, what is the current word? Transparent. I mean, it's not as closed and secretive as it used to be. I noticed when I was picking you up this morning, they were having some sort of conference.
Oh yes.
In the British Academy House itself, which they've had for the last few years, but I don't recall ever until the last few years being invited to conferences there.
Though they've been doing that for quite a long time.
Oh,
I
have
can
they?
remember going to the Academy before I was a fellow myself to hear people talk and things, one sort and another.
Right. Ah, well, to talk, but conferences where people wear name badges and so on.
Yes,
so they're
yes.
giving out this morning.
That's right, yes.
Did they used to? Oh, well, perhaps
I think that's been going for quite some time.
perhaps they
In our old premises in Regent's Park.
Right.
We were already doing that. I
Right.
suspect we're doing more of it than we did, but we were already doing it. It's a continuation of something
Right.
that's been going on for some time.
Right. I don't know if there's any other institutions that I should ask you about that I don't know so much about, that your interest in genealogy or numismatics has taken you into. Is there perhaps some local society that I don't know about that I should?
What about the college? You didn't become a herald.
I didn't become a herald, but no, I was thinking of local things. Oddly, it was I, rather than Margaret, who represented Keele on things like the Staffordshire Local History Council, the Cheshire Local History Council, the Staffordshire Record Society, the Lancashire and Cheshire Record Society. In fact, at one stage I was chairman of the Staffordshire Local History Council, not Margaret, which is absolutely batty when one thinks about it.
No, but I think people prefer a man.
So
think it
I
was
was
so
deputed
odd.
to do those sorts of things.
Yeah.
And I suppose the British Record Society link helped with that sort of thing.
Yeah. Now, these interests that you've always had are very strong, and of course it suits a medievalist with very wide interest to pursue all these things. But of course, economic history in a wider sense has changed a lot in your lifetime. I don't know if you sense that the main thrust of the subject has moved away from these perhaps more antiquarian concerns.
I know what you mean. What people have said to me is that what my money book did was to introduce the findings of numismatists to economic historians, and that I acted as a link man for that, and to numismatists that I gave them an economic history background for what they had been doing, so that the both ways round, people were much made happy by that, because at a very early stage I stopped being a proper numismatist. I wasn't interested in categorising coins. I was interested in money and the use of money.
Yes.
Even as a schoolboy, I was saying I was interested in the effects on the European economy of finding gold in Brazil in the 18th century.
I remember a conference, I don't quite know what the conference was on, but it certainly involved a discussion of mass production.
Yes.
I think it was probably a textile conference of some sort, and there was a lot of interest in how you would define mass production.
Yes.
And so on. And they were talking really about 18th century things. And you absolutely electrified the conference by talking about some medieval recoinage, where the same coin was produced 5 million times or something.
Oh,
And you
more
said
than
this
that.
about mass production, and the people who've been talking about mass production were for several minutes quite speechless.
Yes, this is certainly true. I was probably using the biggest example of that, which is Edward I's recoinage, 1279-82, I think it was, when something in the region of 150 million pennies were produced.
150 million
Pennies
pennies.
were produced in 3 years, mostly from two mints, London and Canterbury. Quite extraordinary, the scale of it.
Yes.
And 5 million coins a year is a normal sort of production from a mint.
Yes.
And I have just actually been lecturing in Sweden on medieval mints, and the biggest medieval mints would have, say, 20 furnaces, and you would have a whole line. You would have a counter with clerks where people would bring in bullion. It would be weighed, it would be assayed, it would go off to the people in the furnaces, it would come out in sheets, it would go off to the people who cut it up. The sheets were fixed thickness. They would cut up these sheets, they would hammer them flat, they would pass them on to the moneyers, who would pass them on to the people who would make them bright by dropping them into. And all these processes had to be very strictly regimented, and because of always loss of precious metals.
Yeah.
So you had a record all the time. So you have daily how much goes to a single team of men.
It's certainly not part of our normal perception of economic history that these are major pieces of fixed
The
capital.
biggest mints are, I think, only surpassed in scale by the arsenal in Venice, that is under one management,
Yes.
and possibly with the Grand Sonnerie in Salas, which is a salt extraction under one management. But no, it's not only mass production, it's a sort of assembly line.
Yes.
The Tower Mint in London, again Edward I, ran around all three sides of the tower, between the old walls and Edward I's new walls, and it was a long series of single-storey buildings, and the work, as it were, went in one end and came out the other.
Yes.
And there was
Astonishing.
only one entrance. Everybody, not only going in didn't matter, everybody coming out was searched. Because after all, theft by employees is one of the things you have to worry about.
Yes. That's absolutely amazing.
But you had no idea of the scale of it. Not 5 million, but
Yes.
no, I think if we have 150 million, let us say 60 million each from London and Canterbury, and 30 million from all the little mints put together.
Yes. Yes.
But
When I joined the staff of University College London, I very briefly, for a term in 1969, had to share a room, rather frighteningly, with Dame Veronica Wedgwood,
oh yes,
who taught, and of course I'd read her before I met her. I thought she's a sort of old-fashioned, sugary historian like Trevelyan or something. And when I met her, because I realised that she was a very sharp and intelligent person, and when she discovered that I was an economic historian, she said, I've got a question, I've been dying to ask an economic historian. She said, what was the monetary effect of melting down of plate during the English Civil War?
yes.
And I said, I just couldn't think of any sensible answer. Must have had some sort of effect. But I looked at her in a new light ever since she asked this intelligent question, to which I don't think any obvious answer can be given.
No, there are repeated melting down of plate at different times in history. I mean, one of the normal things to do is to the crown, nobility, institutions, to abstract gold, silver from circulation and very gradually turn it into plate. And then you have an emergency, it all gets melted down again.
Yes.
And you even have occasions in, say, 15th century France when you have cups made of silver of a mark weight, so that they can easily be melted down. You know what weight your cups
But when
are.
you have the full-bodied currency, and when you have people turning up and melting it down and turning it into money, who is it that's controlling the money supply?
I know what you mean.
I mean, is it as it were, is the decision about how much money there is to be provided in the economy sort of privatised?
It always has been, in the sense that the way a mint operates is not the government sending money to the mint. The money is provided. Well, a mint is run by mint farmers under a set of regulations, and there's a government agent, a warden, to see that they don't cheat, and there's a counter warden, a contre-guard, controller, who, on behalf of the merchants, to see they don't get cheated the other end. But it's the entrepreneurs brings in a lump sum himself to pump prime, so he has money on the counter, and it's the merchants who bring the bullion, old coin, whatever it may be in. They are tempted by the mint price that is offered, and are paid over the counter for their bullion, which then goes through the whole process and comes out and is ready to pay the next people. And where the merchants have their bullion from is from overseas payments primarily. There's a certain amount of reminting of old coin. Every now and then, every generation or so, you have a grand recoinage. But in general, what you are minting is what is foreign coin that has been brought in, or foreign bars of silver, of gold, whatever it might be. One of the interesting things is the discrepancy between what seems to be a balance of payments insofar as you can work one out, say in the 16th century when you've got enough material to be able to guess things, and what you can guess is the increase in money supply when it comes to the next recoinage. And I suspect that there is at any one time a lot of foreign coin in the country, in the city of London that is, never reminted into any coin. And this means it's perfectly possible for people to send
Yes.
coin abroad without any difficulty. And of course this does seep into currency from time to time.
Yeah.
So the money supply is bigger than our guesswork, because we can only guess from what... But yes, until... And of course your money supply is increased in places like Italy by bank accounts. It is increased by shareholdings in government bonds, which are hypothecable. So in other words, you buy a government bond and you can use it as security.
Yes.
So you've got your money twice.
This is M2 and M3.
And yes, a whole range of money. Bills of exchange. I mean, it's sort of 17 times as much or so on some occasions as the actual bullion that's sent from one country to another.
Yes. Yes.
So your money supply increases from the 13th century in paper ways as well, which are very difficult to, you can't estimate them.
This is a very good illustration of the effect that giving a Norman coin to a teenager can have over a lifetime.
That's right.
Very glad that we captured that. Peter, is there anything that you would have liked me to ask about? I mean, there are many things that we could go into too, but is there any sort of quite different thing that I should have asked about that I haven't?
What's interesting is I suspect that at school I followed maths because I was just very good at it, which precocious children often are. But I can remember I remember my first year at school. I was 5. I read Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. So I looked at the next book, which was Carlyle's French Revolution. And I didn't understand it, but the language was marvellous. And I can remember the horror of my what do you call a reception class teacher, who you would then call it, say, could we have Carlyle's French Revolution as the next read aloud book, because the language is so lovely.
Poor woman.
And
Yes.
that would have been at 5.
So you started to shock people when you were 5. Yes.
The first history book that I wrote was in, I think, 1942. when I was 8, when I did a history of Russia. My history of Russia consisted of reading the Telegraph meticulously and making notes and doing descriptions of what was happening on the Russian front. I still have that.
Really?
So I was hooked on current events
Yes.
and on history of some sort.
Yes.
And I
Yes.
can remember also in the war, I was a very young Tory, and the first thing that really hooked my attention was a little booklet that I don't know how I picked it up, on how to run committees and organise things.
Oh, goodness.
And I was hooked on Parliament and what was going on in Parliament.
Right.
So
Right.
those are things that take one a long way
Well,
back.
yes.
So when I've said what
Yes.
formed me when I didn't get any further with maths
Yes.
was a whole range of background.
Right. Right. Very good. Well, that's a very good note on which I think to end.
Yes. Okay.
Let's stop. Thank you very much, Peter. Harte. It's still the 21st of October 2005, and as you will see, we now have both Peter and Margaret Spufford together in front of the camera. Behind the camera I have with me Giorgio Riello, who might ask something later, but we've just finished recording Margaret's tape. I hope we got the last few minutes of that. That was just going over the hour. But while we've been changing the tapes, Margaret and Peter have been giggling a lot over the blue banana, and I think it's about time that Margaret should reveal the secrets of the blue banana.
Yes, the blue banana. We spent a year in the Netherlands together at the Institute of Advanced Studies, and they have their theme groups. We were in one on how typical were the United Provinces. But there was a group of geographers there, and whom we heard quite a lot of, and I was going up the stairs behind them one day, and they were arguing vividly about the concept of the blue banana. And when I got to the top, they said, interested me. I said, excuse me, what is the blue banana? And they groaned and said, you don't know what the blue banana is? And I said, no, I don't. And they then told me, Peter, can you remember
They were it was a French group, I think based in Montpellier,
Yes, I did that too.
that did a study of all the towns over, let us say, 50,000, it might have been 150,000 inhabitants in the then common market, and asked about 10 different criteria on industry, commerce, communications,
Financial
media,
centres.
financial centres, what was growing, what was shrinking, total population, a whole administrative centres, and they then plotted them on a map. And they found that there was an extraordinary concentration in the shape of a banana from Manchester down to Milan. And that Paris was way off on one side and Berlin was off on the other side. So you had an extraordinary thing. Now, it was a banana-shaped thing, and it was meant to be printed on the cover of their book in yellow to show up vividly, or in orange.
As a banana.
But the printers made a mistake and printed it in blue, hence the blue banana. Anyhow, we introduced this concept to our group. We was actually terribly influential in our way of thinking, because thinking about the 17th century Netherlands in a comparative perspective, as the economically advanced area of Europe at that point, we looked back at the southern Netherlands in the previous century, we looked back at South Germany, we looked back at North Italy, and we look onwards into England, all running up and down this blue banana shape. And if I had been asked what the blue banana of the late 13th century was, I would have said it ran from London to Perugia. Actually, I'd probably now say London to Rome. And that in the 20th century blue banana, they had an area of extreme concentration which was the area from Lille, Brussels, Amsterdam, Cologne, that sort of area.
But the
And there was the growth area, which was the Frankfurt, Basel, Munich area. And we could see that in the past. If I'd been asked for by the late 13th into the 14th century, I'd have seen my area of extreme concentration was Tuscany, and the growth area was Lombardy. From there, the next area, the growth area, in the next century was going to be South Germany, and so on upwards, ending up in England in the 18th century, and now moving backwards down the blue banana. So we had a lovely historical thing.
It's always this same spine, as it were, a banana-shaped spine. And what I found really fascinating is that aerial photographs taken at night show it quite clearly. You don't have to go to the lengths those geographers did. You just run an aircraft over it, and you get this
Pattern of light.
As a pattern of light.
Because it's all joined up with motorways with lots of lights on,
Yes.
as well as the cities themselves all being lit up.
But
But the lights will be more banana coloured than blue.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, oh, certainly, the blues.
But we used this, it had enormous influence on what we were writing, because I was being asked to talk about credit for commerce in the United Provinces in perspective. So I ran it from credit in medieval northern Italy upwards into 18th century England. Margaret was looking at literacy, and she looked from literacy in late medieval Italy up to 18th century England. So we ran up and down the blue banana, quite a number of us, in what we were doing. So if you want influences on us, that year in the Netherlands had a lot of
That
influence.
was important.
But the sort of people that you've been interested in, Peter, have always been rather a superior class of people to Margaret's lot.
Oh, absolutely.
Because you're surely merchants and middle class credit. You don't do pawn shops and but poor peasants who run out of money and so on, because that's Margaret.
I did do a paper on that. There's a paper in Annales by me on credit links in 17th century England using the probate accounts. One of my things that I did was to have a research group funded by Leverhulme and the ESRC to work on the surviving probate accounts, which are only 30,000, actually 40,000, we did 30,000 of them. Because just as we were finishing, the PRO turned up another 10,000 in PCC, and the money wouldn't go any further. So the volumes only have 30,000, but the volumes only have a few bits of information. But there's a database of under something like 26 heads. Now, one of the heads is about credit, debt and credit. So I played with that in an article, and that is at a bottom level.
I've forgotten if I've ever seen that. I'm very sorry. But this is almost a joint project, because this is what Margaret was talking about as one of her current things, because she's interested in what it reveals about what young people wore.
Oh yes.
And how much they pay for it, which was a different strand from the same database.
Oh yes, you can use it for medicine, you can use it for clothing, you can use it for debt and credit, you can use it for things like shipping. There's all sorts of things that you can pull out of it. We have recently been playing with it to see whether you can establish ranges of movable wealth for different categories of people, and we've discovered that you can say there are people on a yeoman band and a husbandman band of different urban occupations, which so tradesmen who are often lumped together don't always fit.
I didn't say I'd limited myself to, as I have always, to the countryside. No, I don't go into cities. Which is why I suppose my transcribers are now transcribing London and Middlesex for me. But there are, I think, 28 agricultural specialities listed by Mark Overton. I forget just where, whether it's in the new book or an older one. And we've, with the aid of Peter's figures drawn out of the probate accounts, we could find, for the first time, actually, we had large enough samples of labourers, husbandmen, yeomen, gentlemen, and all sorts of other people cordwainers, smiths, remember?
Tailors,
Tailors,
tanners,
yeah,
weavers,
and
clothiers.
and this is extraordinary because the common people, that is in another, under another hat, I would say, those who have one or two hearths in their houses, the common people cluster round husbandmen who have a median of something like £45 in goods. This is in the 17th century. And there's a sort of constellation of agricultural specialities which cluster around that level, well underneath the yeoman level, and they haven't really been looked at very much because it's extremely difficult to look at them, because all the yeoman stuff, really, they've been picked up on office holding. And these are not office holders in the parish, you see, so you don't get them. So I'm wondering where we go from there, except that I can now begin to dress them, or rather Susan me can, which is very exciting.
But one of the things that
People
came
have to stop.
out of that year was that both of us extended the time span of what we did, as well as not for me the geographical spread. Margaret did her geographical spread from that year, but the time span, and that has come out in my latest thing, which runs from the 15th century to the 21st on financial centres. So I have been made to extend my interest chronologically.
Yeah.
It was a good year, yes.
Now you made some reference to telling us about how you met.
Oh,
That's
do
a very
Peter.
good place to stop. Yes.
how we met each other rather than how we met Brodell, yes.
Oh,
How we met each
bother.
other. That was Esther Moyer again. Esther Moyer had a party in Newnham in the summer of 1959. I was then a research fellow. You've discovered how Margaret was connected to Esther Moyer. And it was mostly research students, research fellows, young dons, and I was having a fairly dull conversation with somebody. Behind my back, I heard somebody being fascinating about the insertion of staircases in the 16th century into houses. And I pulled myself away from the conversation I was having and turned round to join in with this group of people. And it was Margaret.
Yes.
So I heard her and was fascinated by her interests before I saw her.
Before you saw her, and then brought together by a staircase.
Brought together by a staircase.
It has, well, I don't know if you want to ask a final question, Georgia.
No, I think it's
Shall we go out on we'll go out on the final
Let's
staircase,
go out
shall
on
we?
the staircase.
Thank you
You can
both.
tell me what date it was. I
Thank you
can't
both
remember
very much.
today.
16. It was early.
Thank you.